He wasn't born a soldier. He wasn't even Spanish. Yet Ambrogio Spinola, a nobleman from Genoa, became the greatest general Spain ever had. And the man who won wars, he had to pay for himself. His victories shaped empires. His loyalty cost him everything. And when he died, he had nothing left except his honor. This is the story of Ambrogio Spinola, the gentleman general. Genoa, 1569. A city of marble palaces gleaming in the Mediterranean light. Its harbors crowded with ships bound for Spain, the Americas, and the world. In this city of merchants and moneylenders, the Spinolas were royalty. They were not kings, but in Genoa, gold was power, and the Spinolas had plenty of it. Ambrogio was the eldest son of Filippo Spinola and Polissena Grimaldi, heirs to two dynasties older than some kingdoms. Their crest adorned churches, their wealth financed wars, but in a republic run by rival families, even the richest needed more than fortune. They needed favor. And favor, in the late 16th century, came from Spain. Spain ruled half the known world from Naples to Mexico, from Antwerp to the Andes. But for every coin it spent, it owed the bankers of Genoa. The Genoese didn't fight Spain's wars. They funded them. To most Spinolas, war was an investment, profitable, predictable. To Ambrogio, it was something else entirely. It was destiny. He was raised not for battle, but for numbers and scripture. Educated by Jesuits, he learned Latin, logic, and the art of persuasion. He read Caesar and Tacitus not as historians, but as manuals for greatness. He learned that victory wasn't just about strength, it was about patience, order, and will. At 23, he married Giovanna Bacciadone, uniting two of Genoa's most powerful houses. The match secured him wealth, lands, and access to every corridor of power. By all measures, his future was safe. But that safety suffocated him. While his peers plotted trade routes and marriages, Ambrogio studied siege diagrams, Roman campaigns, and the new art of fortification. He was fascinated not by commerce, but by command. He wrote in one letter, "A man may be born rich, but glory must be earned." So when Spain called for volunteers to fight the Dutch rebels in the north, an endless, grinding war in the flooded fields of Flanders, Spinola saw his chance. Others saw a death trap. He saw immortality. In 1602, he made a decision that defied every rule of his class and his time. He would not wait for an appointment or a title. He would buy his own war. He raised an army 9,000 men, Lombard and Italian mercenaries trained, armed, and equipped at his expense. He sold estates, mortgaged family palaces, liquidated his inheritance. His brothers begged him to stop. His wife wept, but Ambrogio's mind was set. When he rode out of Genoa that summer, banners shining, drums echoing against the sea walls, he wasn't a soldier of fortune. He was a man staking everything, money, name, even his soul, on the one thing he could never buy, glory. When Spinola reached the Spanish Netherlands, the war was already in its fourth decade. The Dutch rebels had fought Spain to a standstill, rich merchants funding their freedom, Protestant zeal fueling their resistance. And leading them was one of Europe's finest tacticians, Maurice of Nassau, the Prince of Orange. The conflict had become a contest of attrition, not open battle but sieges, trenches, starvation, and mud. The greatest symbol of that struggle was the city of Ostend, a fortified port on the grey North Sea, the last Dutch stronghold on the Flemish coast. Spain had besieged it for 3 years. Thousands had died. Neither side would yield. And now, the command of this hellhole was handed to a Genoese banker with no battlefield experience. When Spinola arrived, veterans laughed behind his back. A nobleman from Italy, what could he know of Flanders, of its rains, of its endless dikes and canals? But he said little. He listened. He watched. And he learned. He inspected the trenches himself, knee-deep in mud, cannonballs whistling overhead. He slept in a soldier's tent, ate their rations, spoke to them as equals. The men noticed. Morale, that invisible currency of war, began to rise.
Perhaps he is afraid to do.
He reorganized supply chains, built wooden causeways across the marshes, and rotated regiments to keep them from breaking. He studied Maurice's tactics as if they were equations mapping every line of defense, every gun position. His orders were calm, deliberate, mathematical. Spinola wasn't a killer by instinct. He was an architect of war. Each trench was a line of logic. Each bombardment, a calculated risk. The siege dragged on month after month. The damp air stank of powder and rot. In the flooded no-man's land between the armies, bodies drifted like wreckage. When his officers begged him to storm the city, Spinola refused. We win by endurance, not by fury. And so they waited, tightening the noose, cutting the last Dutch supply lines one by one. By late summer 1604, Ostend was dying. Its walls shattered, its wells poisoned, its soldiers too weak to stand. Inside, the defenders knew the end had come. On the 22nd of September 1604, after more than 3 years of blood, Ostend surrendered. Only a few thousand of its 30,000 inhabitants remained. The world took notice. A siege that had swallowed entire armies had ended under the command of a man who'd never led one before. Spinola entered the city not in triumph, but in silence. He ordered food for the survivors, protection for civilians, and honors for the defenders. He told his officers, "The true measure of victory is mercy." In Madrid, King Philip III was astonished. He summoned Spinola to court, awarded him the Order of the Golden Fleece, and named him commander-in-chief of the Spanish armies in Flanders. The Genoese noble, once mocked as a dilettante, was now the empire's brightest star. His portrait was hung beside kings and conquerors, and for a brief, shining moment, Spain believed it had found a new Alexander. But Ambrogio Spinola wasn't fighting for kings. He was fighting for an ideal, that discipline could outlast chaos, and that honor could still exist in war. He had arrived in Flanders a banker. He left it a legend. But Spinola's real test came not from his enemies but from his own government. Spain was broke. The empire of gold had run out of silver. Soldiers went unpaid, supplies dwindled, and when Spinola begged Madrid for funds, he was told, "Use your credit." So he did. He mortgaged everything, his estates, his ships, his family's inheritance. To keep Spain's army alive, he bankrupted himself. In 1605 and 1606, he launched a lightning campaign through the Dutch frontier, taking city after city, Oldenzaal, Lingen, Groenlo, Rheinberg. Each fortress fell not to brute force, but to his methodical precision. He moved like a chess player, predicting Maurice's every counterstroke. By 1607, exhausted, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. And in 1609, Spinola personally helped negotiate the 12 years' truce. For the first time in decades, Europe had peace. But peace brought no rest for Spinola. The Spanish crown refused to repay his debts. He returned to Madrid a hero and a ruined man. When war flared again, this time in Germany, Spinola saw a new chance to serve. The 30 Years' War had erupted, and the Protestant Winter King of Bohemia had seized lands loyal to the emperor. Spain, defending Catholic interests, needed to reopen its Spanish road, the route by which men and money flowed from Italy to Flanders. Spinola led the campaign into the Palatinate, along the Rhine. In less than a year, he captured every fortress from Mainz to Heidelberg. The road was open. Europe watched in awe. The emperor made him captain general, the highest rank in the Spanish army. But again, Madrid gave him no gold, only titles. When the 12 years' truce ended, the Dutch returned to war under Prince Frederick Henry. Spinola, now in his mid-50s, took the field once more. His target, the fortress city of Breda, a symbol of Dutch pride. For 10 months, Spinola surrounded the city, cutting off every line of supply. The defenders fought bravely, digging countermines, firing night raids. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of filth. Disease spread. Men froze, starved, and died. But Spinola's patience was absolute. He believed war could be won by endurance, not slaughter. He treated prisoners well, offered food to civilians, and forbade looting. Even his enemies admired him. Finally, on the 5th of June 1625, Breda surrendered. Spinola received the keys from Justin of Nassau-Maurice's cousin with courtesy and respect. He told him, "The valor of the defeated is the glory of the victor." That single sentence, a code of honor in an age of cruelty, would define his legend. Diego Velázquez immortalized it in The Surrender of Breda, showing Spinola placing a gentle hand on his enemy's shoulder, a gesture of mercy rather than triumph. It became one of Spain's proudest images, a portrait not of empire, but of humanity. After Breda, everything should have been easy, but the empire was dying from within. Madrid's treasury was empty. Its ministers were jealous. And the powerful Count Duke of Olivares, the king's favorite, despised Spinola's independence. When the Dutch retook Grohl in 1627, Olivares blamed Spinola. Funding was cut. Officers went unpaid. Spinola, who had given his fortune to Spain, was now accused of spending too much. In 1628, humiliated, he resigned. He returned to Spain to plead for support and was met not with gratitude, but suspicion. Olivares whispered that the Genoese general was too proud, too rich, too loved by the troops. Philip IV, young and impressionable, listened. To get Spinola out of Flanders, they gave him a new assignment, a hopeless one. A war had broken out in northern Italy over the succession of Mantua. Spinola was sent as commander and plenipotentiary, tasked with taking the fortress of Casale, a nearly impossible siege, deep in hostile territory. He accepted, not because he expected glory, but because he had nothing left but duty. By 1629, Ambrogio Spinola was an old man. Not in years, he was barely 60, but in the weight of what he'd carried. 3 decades of war, 3 decades of loyalty to a crown that had never rewarded him, and a cause that had slowly consumed his fortune, his strength, and his health. Spain called him once more not to Flanders, but to Italy. A new conflict had erupted, the War of the Mantuan Succession, a tangle of claims and alliances that few understood, but that could tip the balance of power between France and Spain. Spinola didn't want to go. He had begged to retire. He had given his youth, his money, his glory, and now the empire demanded his last remaining years. But when duty called, he obeyed. Because to Spinola, honor was not a word, it was a promise. When his ship docked in Genoa, crowds gathered to greet him, their city's greatest son, returning home not as a nobleman, but as a legend. He was no longer the handsome commander who had taken Breda. His hair was white, his hands trembled slightly when he wrote. But when he stood among his soldiers, the fire still returned to his eyes. With him came an unlikely companion, Diego Velázquez, the young royal painter of Spain. Officially, Velázquez had joined to study Italian art, the masters of Florence and Venice. But what he found, instead, was the master of human dignity. Velázquez would later say that Spinola had the face of patience, and the soul of steel. He watched the general not in glory, but in decline, a man who led not through fear, but through quiet certainty. The campaign brought Spinola to Casale, a fortress city in northern Italy. It was supposed to be a swift victory. Instead, it became his final defeat not from the enemy, but from his own country. From Madrid came no gold, no grain, no men. The same story that had haunted him in Flanders repeated again. Empty promises, delayed orders, and political jealousy, this time from Count Duke Olivares, the powerful favorite of young King Philip IV, who despised Spinola's independence and fame. At Casale, the weather turned against them. Rain fell for weeks, turning roads into rivers of mud. Diseases spread through the camp. Horses died by the dozens. Spinola wrote letter after letter, pleading for supplies, each one ignored. His officers begged him to withdraw. He refused. He could abandon a battle, but never his word. One evening, Velázquez found him alone in his tent, staring at a map half covered in candle wax. The general's voice was quiet, almost lost under the sound of rain. "I once believed loyalty would be repaid," he said. "Perhaps it is only not in gold." "If goes comment," he coughed, blood staining his sleeve, then smiled faintly. "Tell your king. Tell him I served as best I could." By September 1630, Spinola could barely stand. He had to be carried to his command post on a stretcher. Still, he insisted on inspecting the lines, his soldiers saluting as he passed the man who had fed them when the crown would not. On the night of September 24, the rain finally stopped. In the silence that followed, Spinola lay in his tent, surrounded by his aides. He whispered two words, the same words he had lived by all his life: honor and reputation. He died before dawn. No priest, no trumpet, no banner, just the sound of wind over the hills of Casale. His body was carried back to Genoa, wrapped in the same cloak he had worn at Ostend and Breda. The journey took weeks. By the time he arrived, his city wept not for a soldier, but for a son who had given everything. He left no fortune. Spain never repaid the millions he had spent in its service. His family received only a title, Marquis of Los Balbases, and the bitter knowledge that their wealth had purchased an empire's glory. But in death, Spinola gained something greater than wealth. He gained immortality. Velázquez, who had returned to Madrid heartbroken, began to paint. On his vast canvas, he captured not battle or death, but grace. In the Surrender of Breda, Spinola stands tall, hand outstretched to a defeated Dutch commander. No arrogance, no cruelty, just compassion. His gesture says everything about the man. The courage of the defeated is the glory of the victor. That painting, Las Lanzas, would become one of Spain's national treasures. But to Velázquez, it was a memorial to a friend, to a leader, to the last true knight of a decaying empire. Spain remembered him as the perfect commander, brilliant, disciplined, and merciful. But history remembers him for something rarer, for showing that power need not destroy humanity, that greatness could coexist with grace, and that even when the world forgot you, honor could still be enough. Spinola never built monuments, but his story became one. The banker who risked his fortune for faith, the general who gave his life for loyalty, and the man who proved that even in the age of greed and empire, there was still room for honor. History remembers kings and conquerors, but the true stories, the human ones, lie in the shadows of their thrones. Ambrogio Spinola stood in those shadows. He fought for men who envied him, for a crown that forgot him, and yet he never wavered. Because for Spinola, greatness was never about power. It was about duty. If you believe the past still has heroes worth remembering, heroes who remind us that loyalty, courage, and grace still matter, then join us. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us next week as another forgotten legend of history rises once more.